Well, Sheikh Sabah couldn't have given me a better introduction for the next part of our, final part of our morning session, which is to present to you the initial findings of our study. Now let me explain to you a little bit, as many of you are here from the business sector and many of us are here from the academic community. So we have a procedure. It's a little different than what you think of when you pick up a book. First of all, Secretary Baker felt very strongly that he wanted the programs at our institute to really bring the best input, not only from the academic input, in other words, the top professors at Rice University and other guest researchers that we bring in for our projects, but to really take the input from the industry and from practitioners. And the best way we have found to implement that is to have a series of seminars and conferences like the one you're participating in today, but also to solicit the industry to help us make our economic models more realistic and more in tune with exactly how the industry operates, and to get feedback on our research program. So we do, as a matter of policy, with our Energy Forum, many of you who are members know this, we have seminars and programs over the course of the study to show the kinds of things we're doing with the modeling, so we can make adjustments as we go. But then before we publish the study is a book, and ultimately this study will become a book. We like to solicit feedback from people like yourselves who are very knowledgeable about the subject, so that we can make corrections and enhancements so that the final product is really not just intellectually interesting, but really hits the timely points and salient observations that the industry has about itself. A few years ago with our book on the geopolitics of natural gas and the feedback we got after presenting the study before we finalized into a book, I think really went a long way to making that a tremendously excellent book. So I'm going to start today talking about our key conclusions. This one? No, that's not it. This is not a self-evident little thing. Which one is it? Oh, okay. Okay, it was on the side, not on the top. There we go. So I'm not going to spend too much time talking about the statistics of where the NOCs stand in the market. This at least just explains, as many of our keynote speakers did this morning, why we chose to look at NOCs and their future in the energy business. Of course, we all know the challenge. We've seen many, many different forecasts. This is the IEA bar chart for where energy demand is expected to go in the next 2 decades or 3 decades. And we posed the question in the study as to whether the shift from having a high participation or proportional participation from the IOCs to having increasingly active participation by NOCs will make a difference in whether or not we'll have timely resource development. And then again, this chart just pictorially shows really that we're seeing a change over the next 30 years, that in the past, the proportion of rising oil production worldwide really did come in large measure, not only from the IOCs, but from the OECD itself. And as you can see from this chart, the projections for the coming 30 years is that the vast majority of oil, 90% of future energy supply, is going to come from the developing world. And of course, the bulk of that is going to be through the production and activities of the NOCs. So in the study, we put together a system. Ambassador Regent mentioned this in his remarks. We did case studies on 15 state national oil companies. People say, well, how could it be 13 and 15? And that's because one of the case studies is on China, and that involves 3 national oil companies. We did economic modeling, looking at the structure of a national oil company, and then from that we did an empirical study on how the activities of an NOC that are not related to its core business affect its operations. And then we also looked at the IOCs, because just making observations about the NOCs without actually looking at the investment patterns of the IOCs, which have been, as you all know from reading the press in recent weeks, a lot of the IOCs themselves are not able to replace their reserves over the last year or so in a manner that they have in the past. So that we've also taken a look at that. As Sheikh Sabah mentioned, we did have this big challenge to decide which NOCs to do. There are so many very important players in the international market. And so we really wanted to make sure that the companies that we studied in depth would range a span of different things that one would want to be able to use for comparison. So we picked some NOCs that were formed even before the 1960s. We made sure to include the new NOCs from the FSU that were formed after the 1990s. We also wanted to have a selection of some state companies that were 100% government owned, some that were partially privatized, and some that were fully privatized, so that we could measure and observe whether privatization made a difference or didn't make a difference in companies' operations. Of course, we had to take into consideration the size of the reserves and the production. We tried to be geographically distributed so that we would not exclude any particular region of the world. And we also tried to look at the companies to get a good representation of those that were very autonomous from their national government and those that weren't. And also we wanted to think about all the companies we picked. We wanted to think about whether or not their business model was such that there was some lesson from the way they operated that could be useful for the whole range of NOCs. And one of the things that we found, and the interesting thing about doing a study like this that took over a 2-year period, where you have meetings and research groupings, is that sometimes you find things that you didn't expect to find. And so one of the things we found as each individual study looked at each of these countries was that there were these categories of activities that were a very high priority for a lot of the NOCs, and they were not related to the core business. And I make this point, sometimes people, gasp a little bit and say, no, we focus on our core business. But let me just say that when we got into the really nitty-gritty details, we found that even a company like Statoil, which is considered a very Western, very IOC NOC, really undertook many of these activities that I've listed here today, whether it was the redistribution of the oil wealth through society, or wealth creation for the nation, or something very much more fundamental related to industrialization and economic development. We're having a new phenomenon now where energy security is becoming an important part of the NOC docket. And I say that not just for the NOCs of consuming countries, like the Chinese and Indian NOCs, but also we're seeing a lot of concern in a country like Iran or some other countries to make sure that there's not fuel shortages for the local population. There's some pressures in countries like Nigeria where the NOC has not performed adequately to prevent that. That's putting some pressure on the NOC from the political system. And also, as we've seen with KPC and some of the other major NOCs from the region, an ability for the NOC to step out and make sure that the company has access to key downstream markets to be able to raise the value of the oil it sells and make sure that it has access to these very profitable markets for sales. And then as Secretary Baker mentioned this morning, we're seeing a lot more NOC activity in the area of alliance building and strategic and foreign policy. And that is, I think, more of a new area for a wider range of NOCs than we've seen in the past. And then we also look at, the case studies look at the sort of movement of politicians in some countries it doesn't apply, but the movement of politicians from the NOC into the political system and back and forth, and the influence that has on the company's operations. And again, I ask you to open your minds a little bit, because the development of the chairman of Statoil and his relationship to the Labour Party in Norway was a critical, major detriment to Statoil in the 80s and 90s. And it was having him move out of the system and having Statoil move out of politics a little bit that has allowed the company to be a much more profitable and productive company today. So it really is across the board with the NOCs that these things that we found in every case study. Even for the companies that people think of as highly commercial, Petronas, for example, was asked to come in a very active role in Malaysia in 1998 during the Asian financial crisis. And so even though there are certain NOCs that present themselves to the Wall Street and to the markets as being very focused on core business, we found that this list of sort of non-core business goals still really predominated in the thinking and operations. And we did find in some cases, but not all, and so it's a little bit hard when you're forced to sort of make a general observation and lump companies together, that there were key cases that we studied where the kind of national priorities that I've just discussed really were hindering some of the NOCs from being able to replace reserves or expand production. And we'll have a presentation of the modeling on how it affected the efficiency and the ability of the NOCs to get the maximum value of oil from a reserve under the ground. Now, it's very hard to present, some of these case studies are 200 pages in length, so it's very hard in a 20, 30-minute PowerPoint presentation to display the information. So we've tried to construct these very colorful schematic charts so you can kind of see a little bit of some of the things that are embedded in the case studies. And what we did is we took each of these categories that I've just discussed, and we made a point here in pictorializing which of these things were really seemed to be a priority over the history of the NOC. And then we made a sort of red and green coding. So if you see a red square, it's our opinion that the motivation for that priority was really had to do with the politics, the political scene in the country, whereas the green would be more related to economic factors, and by economic factors I mean things like the country's overall GDP growth and overall economic development. Obviously, in some countries like Iran, where they offer fuel subsidies, the fuel subsidy is highly political and maybe not really economic. In the case of Iran, it's actually hurting Iran's economy. So, so we're trying to really sort of code that in such a way that we really capture the distinction between something that might be an economic activity, but it's really politically driven, versus something that's an economic activity and it's really economically driven. And you can see that there's a really a wide range. You see, of course, where there's no shading, it means that the NOC doesn't consider that a very high priority. But as you look down some of the columns like PDVSA and Kazmunigas and some of the companies we studied, you can see that there are an awful lot of the boxes that are shaded in. And that shows you how much attention is given to these sort of non-core business goals. Now, just to, again, to give you just sort of a smattering, without going into detail, of how these things manifest themselves sort of company by company and how that looks compared to the IOCs, we tried to pick a couple of bellwether things. For example, does the NOC feel it's very important to provide large employment within the society, and how do they stand relative? And you can see, for example, a company like Saudi Aramco really doesn't use a terrible amount or a large amount of employees per barrel produced but in comparison to PetroChina, it's, you know, quite distinctive. So then, again, I like to say that that this whole question of partial privatization or so forth, so Saudi Aramco, of course, is 100% government known, that one can't just stand up and say, okay, well, if you partially privatize or you privatize, you'll be you know, much less apt to overemploy, because as the chart shows, there's a lot of different range. We also looked at the extent of subsidized prices, again, comparing the NOCs and different countries, and looking at, of course, a lot of the OECD countries actually tax petroleum fuel, not the other way around, not subsidize it. And we did find in the case studies that these domestic fuel subsidies, in certain cases, NNPC and Iran most notably, were really both very debilitating to the possible future and current operations of the NOC, and were also providing a huge burden on the governments. And as you will hear later this afternoon in our case study on Pertamina, one of the things that I think is so interesting in the Pertamina case study is the role that these domestic subsidies played in basically bringing Pertamina down and to a point where not only did Indonesia become an oil importer, but that Pertamina was almost all of its responsibilities inside Indonesia were stripped from it. And it wasn't left to be the important national institution that it could have been. And then we also tried to look at the impact, I think David and some of the other speakers talked about the impact of competition on just the promotion of innovation within an organization. And again, we tried to sort of rank and compare which NOCs face competition inside their domestic home market, and which NOCs are providing that sort of impetus to innovation and efficiency through competition in the international market. And then, and this is, I think, the slide that that bothers people the most, or in the case if you're a BP there and you're at the top of the pile on that slide, that maybe makes you feel most pleased about your operations, is to look at the revenue per barrel produced by these different companies, and look at the huge difference for any individual reserve that is then being translated into the earnings for, you know, the shareholder, whether the shareholder is the citizens of a country or the shareholder are private individuals or entities that own the stock. And as you can see, the huge difference between what NIOC is earning, given its huge fuel subsidies, domestic fuel subsidies, and then take another company like Rosneft that's not highly integrated, and you see the penalty that comes to the value that is able to be reaped for those reserves compared to the international majors and even Statoil, in terms of the value being as high as over $75 a barrel, compared to a single-digit revenue per barrel. Now, we did some modeling looking at technical efficiency, and I won't go elaborately into how to define that because Peter Hartley will speak about this research later in the afternoon, and he'll do a better job, so I'm not going to garble the work of his team by being too elaborate. But I think the interesting thing in this slide, and we all need a magnifying glass to be able to see it, is that there's really a huge variation in how companies turned out under this measurement of the amount of revenue that could be produced of output for output from the same reserves. And as you can see, the IOCs are really much closer to the frontier. The Russian companies fare very poorly. And there's a wide range within the NOC community. There are some companies that are operating quite effectively, and we try to look at, through the case studies, if there are differences in board structure and operational structures that help us understand why there's such a wide range of And so on the general measure, and as you hear the modeling, if you have some suggestions for us on other things that you need, that you think we need to include, so I always a little bit reluctant to publish the generic number or state a generic number, because it's, people hear a number and they think it's a fact, and we're just saying that we're trying to illustrate something. But we did find that when you take some of the NOCs that have these extreme subsidization programs in the domestic market, that their level of technical efficiency was only 35% of those of the companies at the full range, some of the IOCs that are the full range. And that on average, and this of course is not for individual NOCs, but for the group as a whole, that the NOCs were about 60 to 65% of the technical efficiency measure in terms of what the maximization of wealth creation from the reserve as the IOCs. We looked at a lot of other issues in terms of the structure and role of competition. These are some of our key findings. We did find that a lot of the NOCs, even the ones that are 100% government owned, had these autonomous board of directors, and that had a major beneficial impact on their operations. We also found that that the NOCs that had debt, that raised money in international capital markets also had a positive impact into their operations from the transparency and governance standards that needed to be adopted to do that. But as Sheikh Al-Sabah mentioned, that can be done even inside a host country for itself, just by having a government regulate and require that transparency for the national oil company. When you read some of the case studies for NOCs that are less successful, like in Nigeria or Indonesia, you can see that a lot of those structures were not effectively put in place, and it really hindered the professionals in that industry's operations and their ability to do. It's not that people didn't know how to do it, it's that they weren't able to implement it because of corruption and interference and other factors that were not able to be weeded out because they didn't have some of these structures. And then the other thing that we found in looking at the combination of the empirical studies and these case studies was that there's still a tremendous opportunity. A lot of times people talk about IOC and NOC cooperation. There's a sort of overemphasis on technology transfer, which I'm not saying there weren't case studies that showed that there were some companies that were very successful, like Norway, for example, in implementing technology transfer programs. But to us, really one of the most interesting observations was there's still a tremendous opportunity for NOCs to gain value by getting more active in partnerships with the IOC community in these really key consumer markets through downstream cooperation. And you see that in sort of new age cooperations like the ConocoPhillips-Lukoil structure, where Lukoil is becoming increasingly interested in gaining entrance into the premium markets like the US market, which ConocoPhillips, of course, has great, as one of the largest refiners in the United States, has great access. And then in exchange, having ConocoPhillips be able to position itself upstream in Russia in a way that other companies have been a little bit less successful in staying in the game in Russia. And then finally, again, it's very hard to display the information, but we tried to make a slide that would look at some of these sort of structural components that we found in the NOCs that were best able to have national priorities, the ones that I talked about at the beginning of the talk. There were several NOCs in the case studies that were able to meet those national priorities. Saudi Aramco is a good case in point, and have it not actually affect terribly much the company's core business operations in the oil and gas sector. And so the question was, well, were there some things that the NOCs that were highly successful in creating more value, were there some institutional things that they had in common. And so what we try to do with this chart is shade in where the NOC had that particular element that, implemented at a very successful way, versus the areas where there's less shading, where maybe a national oil company didn't have that at all, or had a poorly implemented plan. And you can see in looking at, as the columns go down and thinking about your own observations of those NOCs, that there is a bit of, it is easy to sort of observe that some of these institutional frameworks do make a difference. If you think about Statoil and CNOOC as companies, and see how dark their blue stripe is down this chart, then you can think about and come back into the case studies and see how some of these things have affected their operations in a positive way. And anyway, these are just some of the policy implications of the studies. I think that, hold on, I went forward. Ryan, can you click me back? I hit the thing. We did, of course, because we're an American-based think tank, we also looked at some of the implications and conclusions that we had, and then thought about what that might mean for U.S. policy. One, of course, the big issues that we expect to be very political in the United States in the coming years is just this question about IOC and NOC investment and NOC investment in the United States. We keep mentioning the CNOOC attempted acquisition of Unocal as a interesting case study of a commercial transaction gone awry because of local politics. And so we tried to, in our policy section, really look at what is in the U.S. interests. Is it important to have downstream investment from NOCs in the U.S. market? And is it important for the United States trade policy to try to promote the kinds of institutional structures and transparency procedures and trade policy that will promote the kind of operations of NOCs that we found in the study were very positive for the national country and also just for the energy market in general. And then finally, believe it or not, there was a debate rose over the course that we were doing the study. People kept coming us to the question about, given the fact that China and India and other major consuming countries were having their national oil companies go out and have strategic alliances, did the United States need to have a national oil company? And so we looked at that question, and we decided that it probably would be counterproductive for the United States to try to create a national oil company, that a lot of the benefit of cooperation nation to nation or in the international marketplace is still being achieved. Having the United States have private oil companies, and you can think in modern times of examples where there was a commercial opportunity for an oil company that married together with a U.S. policy perspective, and the U.S. government was able to come in and incentivize a company. The Bako Jehan pipeline is a clear case in point where a private company came in and took on the project, and that the United States could play an active role, the government could play an active role through the OPIC or some other kind of lending agency to make sure that the project took place. And then the other thing panned out very well, even for the soliciting NOC. So for example, China's experience in Iran, their first venture with NIOC, they had drilled 4 dry holes and had to come back and ask for different acreage, so they lost several years and many hundreds of millions of dollars pursuing that first deal. So just because it's government to government doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be at a better rate or at a more successful rate than if it was an IOC. The second thing that we've seen in NOC to NOC versus IOC to NOC, as I welcome you to come and look at the Saudi Aramco case study, because Saudi Aramco is an interesting company. We think of Saudi Aramco as always having been an NOC, but actually when you really go back in time, it was a private American company. It was a consortium of 4 private American companies. And the way Saudi Arabia nationalized that company is really different than the way other companies were nationalized at the time, and so therefore its operations are very different. And the way it makes management decisions and analyzes projects and so forth is very different than a lot of NOCs. But the interesting thing in looking at the sort of interference of politics in the operation of an NOC or an IOC is that if you're thinking about the US government needing to have an NOC so it can somehow get the benefit of this NOC to NOC relationship, that it was precisely because the Aramco partner companies were private firms that when the US government and the Saudi government had tense relations in 1973, the Saudi government wasn't forced to nationalize at that time. And the interesting thing was that under President Roosevelt with the Secretary Ickes, that they had wanted actually to nationalize Aramco and take the shares and put them in an American national oil company back in the 50s. And the interesting thing about that, or 40s and 50s, the interesting thing about that is had they succeeded, perhaps in 73, because the political tension was so high, for sure, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia would have to have nationalized the American government's share. And I think that's also a lesson in thinking about those other big consuming NOCs, like the Chinese and Indian NOCs, which is that once I'm dealing government to government, there's no flexibility. As the Secretary said, you know, because we did a study on NOCs, there's a tendency to emphasize the role of NOCs. But in the end, you have government-to-government relations. And if government-government relations go sour and your investment is tied together in these partnerships, NOC to NOC, then it means the partnership itself can go sour in a manner that if you're dealing with corporate entities and a host government of corporate entities in an NOC, there's some flexibility to give diplomacy and time and effort to weather through. And so we concluded, our opinion was that the United States actually shouldn't pursue having a national oil company. And I know there are others in the United States who disagree with us, but that was one of our key conclusions from a U.S. perspective. So, so that's sort of an overview of our study. I think let's take about 5 or 10 minutes for comments. I mean, you're welcome to ask a question, but also we'd be interested to hear your comments and observations.
I noticed that Petrobras and some of the ones that I wouldn't have considered were significant, were included. I know you're going to debate about that. Why did you have such a light influence on the Latin American countries? It was only PDVSA that I could see.
Right. Well, we did consider Petrobras. We didn't study. It's a little bit arbitrary because we'd already done a big study on Petrobras. So, so that study was available, and we were trying to, you know, do something new. In the case of Pemex, it is an interesting question. I think we were trying to, as I said, get sort of the same question with KPC. These are very important NOCs, but we were really trying to get very different NOCs. And that's why, and indeed, you're correct, on the list there are some NOCs that in international importance are much less internationally important than a Pemex or a KPC, and so it seems like a strange choice. But for example, one of the reasons we picked Kazmuni gas is that it's a NOC just trying to create itself now. And we thought that that would be interesting to look at if you were setting out today and you'd never had an NOC. You know, what are they trying to do, and what does that tell us about how they're operating and how they compare to sort of NOCs that have been in existence for a really long time. So, and also we wanted to sort of give a comparison. We wouldn't want everything in the FSU to be a Russian NOC. So it was very difficult, actually, to make some of these choices, and maybe over time we'll add some other NOCs, because there were a lot of important NOCs that we were not able to study at this level.
IME transparency best practices, that's something that you didn't really touch on, and I was wondering what role you felt there was for the U.S. government in that with respect to both IOCs and NOCs?
Well, in fact, we have a whole paper on that, especially from the perspective of corporate responsibility, looking at the current state of voluntary agreements to the United Nations and other vehicles to really look at the corporate responsibility issue, and we think it's a very important issue, not only just as out of humanitarian and moral considerations, but also from the point of view of avoiding international conflict, and also from the point of view of what's sort of commonly referred to in the academic literature as resource curse issues. So you think about something like the Niger Delta, or where the population and the communities there feel very disassociated from the positive benefit of the oil that's produced in their region, but they're left with a lot of the negative consequences of that particular development. And so we really tried to look at that. And we really felt, frankly, that the United States doesn't play a strong enough role in providing leadership with the international community to making these kinds of agreements that are now sort of voluntary and very loose, really a firm reality in the international system. And we also looked at that from the point of view of trade agreements. So the example I give in the United States, which actually references Pemex, is the United States makes a free trade agreement for North America that was designed to build the economic potential of North America as a trading bloc. And yet we, as a diplomatic effort, and the United States was a lead player in putting NAFTA together, when Mexico said, well, okay, but none of these things can apply to Pemex. Even though it doesn't help Mexico, Mexico is on the verge of becoming a major energy importer and already imports gasoline and natural gas when they have their own resources that could be developed. The United States just says, oh, we don't want to offend Mexico, so we're not going to apply any of these free trade rules to the energy sector. And that probably is not the correct policy. If you look at the experience of Statoil, and that was a very interesting case study, for Norway to join the European Economic Area, it had to create more transparency for Statoil. It had to give up its monopoly status in controlling pipelines in Europe. And it was, very controversial because you have this prestigious national entity, and it's got, sort of state power through its playing its important role in the gas industry in Europe. And yet Norway saw these other benefits to being in the economic area, and so they forced Statoil to become more transparent, to open its pipelines up for open access and do some of these things that one might think would be harmful to Statoil as a national oil company. And yet when you look at the performance of Statoil and the amount of wealth it's generating now for Norway post facto, of it being stripped of these so-called privileges, the company is actually performing much better and providing a lot more state revenue than when it was sort of in that more protected monopolistic status. And so we really feel that the United States, through institutions like WTO and possibly in dealing with some of the NOCs through the Energy Charter, and some of these just bilateral trade agreements, that the United States could show more leadership in helping the global system become more constructive to transparency in countries where the NOC is having difficulty, like in Nigeria or some of these other players.
Have you looked at the effect of some of the privatization that's going on in some countries on NOCs?
Yeah, I think that Peter Hartley can talk about this a little bit more in his presentation. I think that we found, generally speaking, I mean, it's not an end-all be-all, and as I mentioned, when you look at Saudi Aramco, which is a company that doesn't borrow and hasn't privatized and probably is not even looking at it, they still run a very effective operation. They're still able to expand their industry. They're still sort of close to their target of being 50% integrated. And they're still affiliated their operations, not always, but are generally autonomous from government interference. So it's not a necessity, but we did find a very positive impact for the companies that did partially privatize. And we did, in our measurements, it did seem to actually make a difference what your level of privatization was. In other words, if the government ownership was a higher percentage, then the chances of you remember my chart with the BP being at $75, that you were going to be sort of leaving money on the table, so to speak, that some of the practices that the market sort of forces on management by the nature of privatization brought these benefits. In the case of Statoil, you can see that the benefit includes the money that's going to go to Norwegian citizens from the operations of the company.
I believe that IOCs are in a way NOCs, because if some of the GCC countries would create an ownership on these IOCs, there might be a United States prevention on these kind of transactions. So IOC is not, by definition and by behavior, yes, they are multi-international corporations. But if there is an investor from the GCC country on these IOC, there might be a question mark on these transactions.
I think that that's true, and I think that we felt that like one of the purposes of the study is that you're getting like a very unsophisticated debate in the United States about whether we can blend NOCs and IOCs and what that would mean for U.S. energy security and so forth. And so we really felt that that is really a critical issue that needs to be debated, and it needs to be debated in an intelligent fashion. And the sort of level of debate that came out in the United States during the Unocal thing, it wasn't that maybe, you know, you could look at the outcome and so forth. It was very complicated, but the level of debate in the United States about whether it was a good or bad thing was really at a very low quality. And it is something that we really feel strongly people need to understand. And you're right, the lines have gotten very blurry. And I think when Tom Langford speaks later in the afternoon, he'll discuss that a little bit. He discussed it in Houston and got a big reaction from the audience in thinking about how the market is valuating each of those entities. I mean, we sort of now refer to IOCs, not so much because their operations are that different than the NOCs, but also just because they are these publicly traded companies, and there is something structural to reporting back to a shareholder that's really different than reporting back to a government and having to worry about overall society.
The relationship between IOCs and NOCs obviously varies a lot around the world. So in some areas they're separate joint venture partners. So for example in India. In some areas the IOCs are actually equity owners within a national company, for example in Abu Dhabi. And in some areas the IOC sort of provides secondees under a technical service agreement, for example, in Kuwait. Did you have any observations about whether the nature of that relationship impacts the performance of the national oil company, or how it does? That's a really interesting question. I'm not sure if we captured that. That might be something that we could go back and look at, because of course, you know, we're very familiar with what companies. We do have a study that is not quite finished yet that was trying to analyze the sort of same balance sheet issues for the IOCs, and maybe that's something we should look at in considering that in terms of what kinds of participations the IOCs have. I think it's captured a little bit in the section of the study that looks at the impact of competition. So like if you look at the Norwegian case study, the impact that there was not only, one of the things we found was that was a benefit was not only just having the international majors or international independents operating in the sector, so the NOC has to actually compete with those companies in terms of their drilling and costs of production and so forth. And again, you see that in Statoil, where their cost of production was so much higher than the international companies, and because they then had transparent operations that became known to the public, and there was pressure on them to reform themselves. But you also see it, which is very interesting, and one of the interesting observations about the study, was that there's also the possibility of having NOC to NOC competition. So when you look at a place like Iraq, where they're trying to debate what to do, it raises this interesting question: if I have more than one NOC, is that also beneficial to the ultimate end result? And I think that one of the things we found was that in domains where there's more than one NOC in a country, like Norway or China, that the companies do have this competition, that they are judged by the government as to who's performing better, and this has sort of a positive impact. And also, of course, as I showed in the chart, something like Kufbeck going abroad also brings a competitive element into Kuwait, because of course this company is having to operate abroad and compete for acreage and so forth, and compete in its operations abroad. Well, okay, this seems like a very good time to break for lunch. We have tables set up and there's a buffet. We will have about an hour lunch break, and we'll see you back here. Thanks very much. And then Jeff.
Because he was a new office in Beijing, now he will be chair your meeting.
Right, yes, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Good. So when you take this stay in touch and sure. What do we do? Just follow the news, or how do we?
Yeah, it'll be done quite.
It'll be something.
I ran out of cards. Sorry.
Okay.
And then we'll take what happens in the future. Committed to Pune first. We sit down with Kuwait News Agency for a couple of minutes, and then I'll give you your 4 minutes.
I'm not going to see their information.
أراجع لك هنا هذا ما لي شغل.
The whole chain.
And you'll find it. I'm here. Inshallah. Unless you're going someplace.
Now it would just be crazy. The last time I've left.
It was such a beautiful day and lunch was so pleasant, it's kind of hard to come back to work, but we're going to begin the afternoon session. In the interest of time, I'm going to refer you all to the bios that are in the agenda. Instead of introducing everybody with their bios, I'm just going to tell you what aspect of the study each of the researchers worked on, and we'll have each researcher present their work, and then we'll take some questions and comments. Our first presentation is going to be by Peter Hartley, who is an economist at Rice University, and he is going to talk about the IOC, NOC economic issues.
We'll try to talk loudly, maybe we'll entice a few people back in here. But if I talk too loudly to them and they hear what I've got to say, maybe they'll stay out there. Anyway, my first comment is this is very much joint work with Ken Medlock, who's Energy Fellow at the Baker Institute, and Stacey Eller, who's one of our graduate students. And the basic idea behind the work that we've done was to try to take an overview of this issue of NOCs versus IOCs. So when we started planning the study, the idea behind was to have a lot of case studies that looked at details, behaviour of these particular NOCs, but then we wanted to try and characterise what it means to be an NOC versus an IOC, take a view sort of at the higher level, a helicopter view if you like, and that's what we tried to do with this model. And the two parts to my presentation is actually two papers, so I'm going to skip through pretty quickly to handle two papers in 15 minutes. So bear with me on that, and the papers are available, as Amy's mentioned, if you can get all the details. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is a theoretical model, and so we want to develop a theoretical model first to think about what it is we should be looking for before we have a look at the data. The basic idea behind the theoretical model is that, as we say here, that the key difference between a fully government-owned firm and a shareholder-owned corporation is that the claims to residual income, or the returns to capital, we used to think of, or the returns to bearing risk, in the case of a shareholder-owned company, of course, go to the shareholders, and then they compensated for bearing the risk. But in the case of a government, in the case of NOC, those returns go to the government, and that has the critical consequences for the behaviour of the firm. So in particular, you don't have marketed claims to the return to capital. We don't get an easy measure of managerial performance. Also, debt is often guaranteed by the government, and can't make the firm go bankrupt. Has implications for the behaviour of the firm. One consequence is you tend to get weaker monitoring, though as was pointed out this morning by Sheikh Al-Sabah, I mean, there can be special cases where the NOC can deviate from what we're thinking of here as the extreme form. So we've got like a caricature of the firm, NOC here, if you like. And particular firms, of course, can deviate from this extreme case we're talking about. One of the departure points here, again, came up in the discussion this morning, is this notion that often NOCs are a cash cow for the government, or they're starved of funds for investment. So one way of thinking of that is there's a lot of pressure placed on the NOC to produce revenue right away. Now, of course, there can be deviations from that as well. In some countries, the NOCs may be encouraged to be much more forward-looking. We're just saying in a sort of prototypical case, if you like, the common conception is that these firms often find it very difficult to get financing for reinvesting in reserves and making other investments, because the government is trying to skim off as much revenue as possible. The other consequence often of political interference is there's a very strong pressure to increase domestic employment and also to subsidise domestic consumption. So they are key features that we built into the theoretical model to the differences between, let's say, a prototypical NOC and a prototypical shareholder-owned firm. Then we put all that into a model of the behaviour of any firm that's trying to exploit a resource like oil with a strong intertemporal component, where you can leave the oil in the ground and have it available for production in the future. And we try to build into the model things like increasing cost of development in the short run. If you try to develop like we're seeing right now, that's all sort of part of the model. And also the firm, as it exploits resources, the costs tend to rise, production costs, but also costs for finding new resources and so on. And a consequence is that we actually get output production curves, profiles, like in the top left here, which are quite firm would be structure of production of oil over time. The top right will be what's happening to reserves, proved reserves. And then actually in this model we end up having reserves left in the ground because you have economic exhaustion of the resource, not physical exhaustion, because of the increasing costs. Now the blue and the red lines in these pictures distinguish what we're calling NOC from an efficient firm. So the blue line is our NOC and the red line is the efficient firm. And what you can see in the top left is this incentive to produce cash quickly means that our prototypical NOC has actually higher output in the short run but lower output in the long run. The top right shows that it underinvests in reserves. Bottom left is overemployment, and the bottom right, if the cash flow actually is less. So this incentive to try and produce income in the short run actually comes at the expense of cash flow in the longer term. And the interesting thing we found when we did this model, we didn't know that this was going to happen, but when we actually started studying this, it turns out that a lot of these distortions I've talked about all work in the same direction and reinforce each other. So this emphasis on current revenue, this need to produce cash for the government, actually contributes, you see on the bottom left, to overemployment. And so the way to read these pictures is we want to read anything that's a positive, shows that the employment level is actually higher. And the two, in this case, the blue and the red don't correspond to the NOC and the efficient firm, they correspond to different degrees of emphasis on producing current revenue. So all of the pictures here represent, in the sense of sort of the NOC case, so to speak, but different degrees of it. So the red is much more extreme emphasis on producing current revenue. And you can see in the bottom right, actually, that's frustrating. If you really want to push the firm to produce a lot of current cash flow, you can do it a little bit. You can see if the red, you compare the red with the blue, but beyond a certain point, there's a very limited ability to do that. And the top right also showing that the higher the pressure there is to produce current revenue, you end up with less reserves. The blue line shows that actually there's a slight increase in reserves in the short run if you only have mild pressure to produce current revenue. If you have extreme pressure though, actually the investment reserves is lower throughout the time horizon. And then if we look at the effect of the employment incentive alone, whoops, I'm at two slides I guess. Look at the, two slides the other way. It's a bit tricky, this button thing, isn't it? Okay, so here's the effect of the employment incentive alone. In this case, the interesting thing is, of course, the incentive to try to increase domestic employment, of course, it increases domestic employment, but the top right shows that it also results in less investment in reserves, so it reinforces the previous effect. And then the next one, which was sort of surprising to us, when you have this pressure to subsidise domestic consumption, it also gives you a pressure to increase domestic employment, increase employment in the firm. So all of these effects reinforce each other and have this result that we tend to have underinvestment in reserves and overinvestment in employment. So that's sort of a brief tour of how that model works. Then give you a sort of equally brief tour, I guess, of the empirical results. What we did then was we collected data on 80 firms, sample of 80 firms over the period 2002-2004 from Energy Intelligence originally, ranking the world's oil companies. But then Stacey painstakingly went back and checked all of these numbers by looking at annual reports and so on, and we have a really nice clean database. We collected data on revenue, reserves, employment, production of natural gas, crude oil and crude oil products, and then the extent of government share. And we used two different methods to test the relative efficiency of these firms. One is data and development analysis, DEA, and the other was a stochastic frontier approach. And then, motivated by our theoretical model I just talked about, we focused on revenue as the output measure. And we wanted to use revenue as the output measure because, as was emphasised, political pressure is likely to force the NOC to subsidise domestic consumption, which will reduce its revenue, even if it doesn't reduce output. And then we conclude then from our analysis that if we find the difference between these firms, that it's evidence in favour of the idea that the objectives of the firms may differ as we postulated. And then we're going to allow, as the theoretical model allowed, inputs of employees, oil reserves and natural gas reserves. So here's a sample of our companies, the 80 companies that we used, and they've been organised, the table's been organised into three groups. And the top left we have the national oil companies, bottom left we have the major international oil companies, and then we have the rest over on the right. And if you just focus on I presented there the percentage of government share, which of course is 0 for the IOCs and the firms on the right, but varies for the ones on the left amongst the NOCs. So we have a range of NOCs here from fully government owned to partially privatised. And the other two columns give us the revenue per employee, which Amy graphed some of that data, and revenue per barrel of oil equivalent of reserves. And you'll notice that, if you can read the numbers, that they take the IOCs down the bottom. Revenue per employee is about twice as high as it is for the NOCs, and the firms on the right are in between. And if you take revenue per barrel of oil reserves, again, it's maybe 3 times almost for the IOCs over the NOCs as a group, and again, the other firms are in the middle. What we can do is we can graph those numbers, put those numbers on a graph, and on the horizontal axis here we've got reserves per employee, on the vertical axis we've got revenue per employee. And well, what you can see here is if you just plot those, we can put a straight line here which encompasses all the firms, and that's what's called the data envelope. And you see the yellow triangles are the major IOCs, and they're up all near the frontier. The other firms are inside the frontier. That's sort of the notion behind this data envelopment analysis. So it does that in a more sophisticated way. Then 2 other measures that we included in our study, once we've explained why firms may be away from this frontier, 2 factors that are important in that would be this degree of subsidy, from the basis of the model, the degree of subsidy of domestic oil product prices, and that's measured, we use this data on average prices at the pump for diesel and gasoline to determine the extent of domestic subsidy. And then the other key variable for our hypothesis is the government ownership share. And then what we have here is the data envelopment analysis technical scores. And this is like the picture that Amy showed. I believe this is the one, or maybe she showed the other one. She may have showed the stochastic frontier one. But in any case, what you do is you can graph the degree of technical efficiency or the deviation from the frontier. And you can see the yellows are the majors, and they're all up close to the frontier. The reds are the national oil companies, the blues are the other firms. And the reds tend to be over there to the right, but not entirely, of course. So as was emphasised this morning, not all NOCs are the same. But overwhelmingly, they tend to be found amongst the less efficient firms, as measured by this. And then what we can do is explain that degree of deviation from the frontier with 2 different factors. So if we're able to explain all of the deviation from the frontier with these factors, what would happen would be when we included these factors, all the firms would have a measured efficiency of 1. What you can see is when we include these 2 factors, the degree of vertical integration and the extent of government ownership, it moves a lot of the firms up to 1. So in other words, a lot of the inefficiencies that I showed in the previous slide, inefficiencies in generating revenue from the given inputs, a lot of those seem to be explained by the extent of government ownership, but also the extent of vertical integration. But not all of them, and in particular on the right, we still have some firms that are a long way from 1 that are Russian firms. So there's an extra Russian factor, so to speak, that we haven't captured in the things that we've measured. The other method of testing for efficiency deviations is to use a statistical analysis where we estimate what's called a stochastic frontier. And the first column on the left of this table gives us the simple model like the DEA analysis, where all we do is regress revenue on the inputs of employment and reserves. And then what we do in the second column is we add in the government share and the degree of subsidy of the oil products. Government share and the vertical integration. And what you see is that explains some of the inefficiency. Then if you move to the right, where you have a variable for 2-tier pricing, and then finally the final model on the right, all those coefficients actually statistically significant at the 0.0001% level. So we have the very strong results that you can explain a big part of the inefficiency with the 2-tier pricing, the overemployment and the overemployment in the government firms. And the little graph on the right shows you one of the bars, the blue bar is the actual revenue for different types of firms. The red is what we get from our model, and it's sort of a measure of the goodness of fit. And you can see that we fit the evidence there quite well. And then this is the next one that graphs, again, the relative efficiencies of the firms. The bright colours are the original model, where we just have inputs, revenue as a function of inputs. And then the light bars show you what happens when you allow for the amount of government ownership share and the 2-tier pricing. Again, all the firms move up to a very similar technical efficiency level if you draw a horizontal line through those, except for the ones on the far right, which once again overwhelmingly dominated by the Russian firms. Will redistribute revenue via overemployment and underinvestment in reserves and by subsidising domestic consumption. Many of the influences reinforce each other, and the evidence statistical evidence we looked at confirmed that prediction. We further found specific evidence that overemployment was a strong common feature of government-owned firms, and domestic price subsidies negatively affect their ability to generate revenue. The relative technical inefficiencies which are observed when one considers only commercial objectives are largely the result of governments exercising control over the distribution of rents. And as was mentioned this morning, the foregone revenue will, however, reduce government spending on other items or require higher taxes. So product subsidies or overemployment are maybe inefficient ways, really, to redistribute income. The government may be, if it were possible, to extract the rents in a more efficient way and then have more targeted transfer programs, for example. So I'll leave it at that, and I guess we're going to take questions after the... Take questions now, okay. Yes?
If you were to isolate or study just purely in terms of the exploration and production and strip out the downstream, how different would your conclusions be?
Right, well, as you saw, the vertical integration variable played a role in increasing, allowing firms to get more revenue from the given resources that they've got under their control. So part of the reason we did that is so that we could focus sort of control for that factor, if you like. What we also did in the study was to, you can look at a subset of firms that we exclude the vertically integrated, more of the vertically integrated firms. Of course, the difficulty then is most of the majors are integrated, so you can't, but you still find this effect of the government ownership on the remaining ones that are still in the sample. Yeah. Yeah, I'm sure that the relative rankings of the different companies would be affected, but what we still find is a strong statistically significant effect of the percentage of government ownership on these kinds of measures of efficiency, even if you just look at firms that are primarily focused on upstream activities. I saw some more hands. Oh. Okay.
Presenter is Akira Hanzawa, who is the Deputy Director for Research and Planning at the Japan Petroleum Energy Center.
Thank you very much for this very precious opportunity. So I'm really delighted and honored to speak in front of such distinguished people. And the honor also because it is after 10 years absence, I'm very much impressed with the change that Dubai has made. And today I'd like to speak about the gist of Japan's national energy strategy and NOCs. And by NOCs, I'll talk about a summary of Japan side NOC studies for the past 2 years together with the Baker Institute. Oh, sorry. I'm sorry. Well, disabled seems to have become fairly popular these days. It's a comparison between Japan and the other OECD countries on the positions, energy security positions. And Japan depends on oil as its primary energy source by 50%. And it also depends on the on import for the acquisition of oil by almost 100%, so almost totally dependent on the foreign countries. And out of the total import, about 90%, to be exact, 89%, the Japan depends on the Middle East for its oil import. This shows that a quite vulnerable position of Japan in comparison with the other OECD countries. Actually, the new energy strategies of Japan, which was made by the government last year, actually starts with these three principles, three targets. The first one is to realize energy security measures that people in Japan can rely on. Number two is to set up the basis for sustainable development, so the integrated solution of both energy and environmental issues. These two issues, energy and environment, quite often go as conflicting elements with each other. The number three is to contribute to overcoming the energy problems in Asia and the world as a member of this planet Earth. Well, the strategies deal with several items and give certain targets one by one. But when it comes to talking about the gist of it, the very essence of the strategy is energy conservation. This energy conservation we strive to achieve the highest goal, so we understand. Because in the past 30 years, since the first oil shock in 1973, Japan has achieved almost 40% greater energy efficiency. And I think it can be regarded as one of the top countries in energy conservation. And setting a new target of further 30% improvement in energy efficiency for the year 2030 is really an ambitious strategy and target setting, because already its starting level is so high that there remains very little to be saved in excess of its various minimum. And talking about the policy measures to realize that target, there are three main pillars. The first one is to establish specific strategies to introduce groundbreaking technologies for energy conservation. First, rough draft of strategy will be made up field by field, and the government and the private sector will discuss together to specify which field of technology will be most needed, will be required the very cutting-edge technologies for the year 2030. Number two is to further reinforce the coordinated joint approach between the government and private sector, as shown in the action cycle on the screen. First of all, the government is supposed to set a guideline, and in line with that, the private companies voluntarily prepares an action plan to fulfill that guideline target. Then, after some time, if the government regard it necessary, then the government will call the private company concerned and to give some guidance to them. And when, after a certain period, if the performance is judged to be rather poor, then that result is supposed to be disclosed by the government, and also the poor performing companies will be given some advice to remedy the situation. And number three is to introduce a top runner program. It's something like a very like the benchmarking approach to set and decide on which company is at the top level, and that same level is to be followed by the other companies in the same field of industry. So this approach will be applied to various sectors, including household and residential sectors. Sorry. This is the last paper on the energy strategy. It shows Japan's approach toward the energy issues. And the circle is, well, the circle showed Japan itself. And under this new national energy strategy, the government and possibly the royal families will be requested to be engaged in the more active resource diplomacy, and the private companies will follow it through as industrial clusters, field by field. And most important spirit of it is the efforts at all levels as a one single entities to make an effort toward the same directions. And various government organizations, public institutes, and private companies will periodically exchange information, and after having set these specified plans to be referred to later on, those at the group at all levels will make further efforts towards securing these precious energy resources. I'm coming to the summary of our NOC study conclusions. And we have been doing this study in search of certain policy implications at the end of the study. First, this is how we view the NOCs in groups. Well, to aim at the successful resource diplomacy. And we have classified altogether 11 countries and NOCs into 4 groups. And the one group is the traditional Middle East suppliers, and another one is an Asian, countries. The third one is the Russian, Afghanistan, we may expect a new oil flow. And the last one, the potential joint venture partners, a country in South America, Africa, and North Europe. The sample position of 4 NOC groups is horizontal axis shows supply potential, and the vertical axis shows the need for investment. The more the supply potential, then the more need for investment. That is the notion. But simply that there exists a great need for investment, but at the same time, they will have to expect certain difficulty in realizing that needed investment. And in any way, the collaboration is a key word in our approach to these groups. Well, I think nobody will disagree. The oil producing countries and consuming countries have to make the more strengthened ties with each other. And we, as one of the Asian countries, will make more closer partnerships with the Asian countries, and through this grouping, we'll try to further strengthen the relationship with the Middle Eastern oil and gas producers and other producers and exporters of oil and gas. The optimization effect will be greater when applied to wider areas. So this chain of alliances could be further extended eventually to the whole world. That is the eventual ideal of this concept. Still, the working ladies is looking toward the other directions. This slide shows how we can build up more constructive and cooperative relationship with NOCs and related organizations. Anyhow, step 1 through 5, we have to first confirm the needs of NOCs. And step 2, to match the needs with our seats, what we can do. And in the right-hand side corner, I put out some of the candidate fields of our corporations. And step 3, to create frameworks and systems for corporations. And step 4, to test run that system and adjust as required. And finally and eventually, we hope to enjoy an ideal and a creative relationship with NOCs and related organizations. And Japan's candidate fields for cooperation include technologies on energy saving, petroleum refining, petrochemicals, engineering, and environment, EOR, and education, including technical training. These are the concrete field. We have already been engaged in this kind of cooperation with a number of countries, but we should further strengthen and further exert more efforts into this direction. This is the final paper. Suggested direction for further actions. We should further develop to complete the basic concept of the approach I have been explaining here and specify and coordinate in more concrete way the role of relevant organizations in Japan to realize the much more solid cooperations among us. And number 2 is to devise specific action plans for collaboration based on the strategic design to be finalized from now on for actual and appropriate application to the respective NOCs. And lastly, anyhow, to start communicating more freely with the NOC counterparts to bring the action plans mentioned here to further perfections and to create and institutionalize, if necessary, any further systems for more effective implementations. Well, it may not sound so concrete, but could be the first step toward the future more specific policy directions. Thank you for your attention.
Our presentations of the various case studies. Our first presenter is Stephen Lewis, who is a research fellow at the Baker Institute and our director of Asian Studies.
Thank you all for the opportunity to come and share some of our research on the Chinese national oil companies. And I know the speaker immediately after me, my good friend Mr. Xu from CNPC, will talk more about CNPC in particular and its going abroad strategy. And some of the other speakers will be talking about, have already talked about NOCs and what are some of the ways that they are able to take advantage of ownership and regulation and these things in order to become more efficient. And I think, as some of the speakers in the morning session mentioned, somewhat counterintuitively, even national oil companies do have ways to improve their effectiveness if they're able to take advantage of competition. And I think this is one of the key findings of the Chinese national oil companies case study, and that is that because you have some aspects of competition between them, they actually can be somewhat effective in going abroad and bringing home some resources for China's economic development. And so very briefly, I'll just focus on these aspects The study is actually much longer and goes into a lot more detail, and also talks about some of the ways that NOCs are being tapped for social welfare development needs and other issues. But today I'll just focus very briefly about these competing aspects. But first, let me give you a very quick introduction to the three Chinese national oil companies and how different they are. The first one is China National Petroleum Company, or CNPC. The PIW ranking in terms of size put it at number 9 in 2005. Its onshore crude produced from about 50 fields in 2005 was about 2.12 million barrels a day. It imported about 700,000, much of it from Sudan, from overseas assets in 2005. Refining capacity from 39 units at 2.4 million barrels a day in 2005. Dalian will be upgraded to 410,000 barrels a day in 2006. In 2000, it listed in Hong Kong and New York as PetroChina, part of it, and its profits in 2005 were 133.4 billion RMB, or about 15 billion US dollars. It paid special taxes in 2005 at about 20.25 billion RMB, or about a little over $2 billion. The second largest one, Sinopec, which is traditionally the downstream state-owned oil company in China. It had a PIW ranking in 2005 of 28, much smaller. Its onshore crude produced was 760,000 barrels a day in 2005. It imported much less than CNPC at only 100,000 barrels a day from overseas assets. Its refining capacity is much stronger, however, than CNPC, 56 units at 3 million barrels a day in 2005, with large investments in units at more than 200,000 barrels a day, including Zhenhai, Maoming, Jilin, Qilu, Shanghai, Gaoqiao, and upgrading the Guangzhou refinery to 260,000 barrels a day in 2006. It also has the joint venture with Kuwait at Nansha, KPC, process 300,000 barrels a day in 2010, and other ones with ExxonMobil and Saudi Aramco and Fujian at 240,000. So it also is making significant investments in refining. It also listed in 2000 on Hong Kong and New York as Sinopec, and Thomas Langford, I can talk more about this if you have questions about how that works. He was involved with that. Its profits in 2005 were much less than CNPC, but still substantial, 39.6 billion RMB, or about $5 billion. Its special taxes in 2005 were about 5 billion RMB, putting about 600 million. Then there's CNOOC. Its crude offshore production was from 44 fields in 2005 at 500,000 barrels a day, imported 200,000, as you can see, more than Sinopec. It is getting into refining and making significant investments with the Guangdong refinery, expected to produce 240,000 barrels a day in 2008. It also listed in Hong Kong, New York as CNOOC. Its profits were not much less than Sinopec, 25.3 billion, and its special taxes in 2005 were about the same as Sinopec. What does this mean? Why am I talking about special taxes? Because in the Chinese fiscal system, which is not very well developed and is moving towards the direction of trying to capture more from the private economy and individuals, overall, the central government is still very much dependent upon the 190 central-owned enterprises directly under Beijing's control. And in the history of privatization and deregulation in China, the central government has been shedding most of the manufacturing enterprises and concentrating in a few core sectors. Energy is one of them, IT is another, electronics is another. The sectors where it feels that it has made significant investments, and it can also play a role in turning these state-owned enterprises into companies that can compete internationally. And it has identified the energy sector as one of those. And so of profits of all the central-owned enterprises in 2005 were about 904 billion RMB, or about $120 billion. NOCs, the three NOCs were 200 billion, so about 25% of the revenue going to the central government from state-owned enterprises came from the NOCs. About another 25% came from the IT companies. I think this is important to mention because it shows just how dependent the central government is upon the NOCs. And so it has a strong incentive to support them. And why do they need to support them? Well, the growth in demand in 2006 in energy supply will be 38% of it is expected to come from China. China consumed 6.8 million barrels a day of oil in 2005. The NOCs produced about 3.8 million, so we need about 3 million barrels a day in imports. And then a lot of the IEA estimates are that China will be importing substantial amounts, as it goes up to 10 to 13.6 billion in 2020. So the Chinese NOCs have had support from the Chinese government in going overseas, and they themselves see the very strong reason to do so. But the going abroad strategy of Chinese NOCs are mediated, their effectiveness is mediated by several historical facts. I think a lot of the case studies have talked about the history of privatization in particular in the host countries and the ownership governments and how that's affecting their strategies. And so far, China seems to be successful in going abroad. But I think what my case study shows is that part of the reason they've been successful is they have gone to regions in the world where they're able to take advantage of unique ties of the Chinese government and then the strengths of the Chinese NOCs. So, the success case really is Sudan in Africa. And this is one where they face constrained competition, obviously from the IOCs. But then at the same time, as with much of Africa, the Chinese government is able to bring in some resources to help them out. And this is because China is not viewed as a colonial power in much of Africa. And in fact, it has made many decades of substantial investments in training African people, lots of aid projects. And so it's able to bring to bear a lot of these. Related to that is the fact that they're able to work with a lot of other state-owned companies who are trying to bring in other resources from African countries. And so within the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs, there is more and more expertise in dealing with Africa. Whereas before it was somewhat more of a marginalized area within the Ministry of Foreign Affairs bureaucracy. At the same time, in another area that we might look at and say, well, why don't we have more success, at least most Chinese would talk about it, would be relations with Russia and trying to bring the pipeline of Siberian oil down into China. And part of the problem there has been that the bureaucracy and the leadership in China have been very much, up until very recently, have been very much split along the lines of certain leaders or groups are tasked with dealing with the major powers, including the ones on China's borders. So there's a Russia group. There's also a North America group. There's a Japan group. And these groups are not necessarily overlapping with those dealing with economic development or general aid issues. And so it's been a problem for them to work together with the NOCs in some areas, whereas they work very well in other areas. And the case study talks a little bit more detail about some of those. At the same time, the Chinese NOCs are very much deeply involved in the restructuring that is going on within the Chinese Communist Party and the government. Because as I mentioned, if 25% of your revenue is coming from these state-owned enterprises, this also reflects the fact that you want to be able to make sure that this is also controlled. And so historically, the Chinese oil fields and refineries, as they grew and they became much larger, they were given higher rankings within the Chinese government and Communist Party bureaucracy, such that the head of the Daqing oil field, for example, or the Shengling oil field, they had party ranking and status equivalent to ministers. And so as they've decentralized, they've also found it hard to try and rationalize political decentralization at the same time as privatization. And finally, I would just want to mention that the role of the NOCs in the broader economic development plans of China are still not very clear. When it comes to developing the national energy infrastructure, it's still not clear who is going to pay for this. We see this now in the development of plans for the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. It's still not clear how much of it will be paid for by government, how much of it will be paid for by the NOCs. This also includes the National Social Welfare Plan. China's privatization has worked from the bottom up, such that the peasants decollectivized, then the small factories, and then the service sector in most of the cities. And as they privatized, they largely turned over the economy to the workers in those areas. But this large state-owned enterprises directly controlled by Beijing, like the NOCs, they have the problem of all of the rules and the laws and regulations were set up for all of those smaller enterprises to actually privatize. Whereas these very large companies, now they're at the point where China is trying to set up a national social welfare plan where everybody is covered for pensions and for healthcare, universal healthcare and things like that. But it's trying to find the cost for doing that. And so it actually increases the potential for Chinese NOCs, especially successful ones like the NOCs, to be viewed as potential cash cows to pay for this. Related to that is also the cleanup of environmental problems, which is still not very clear who will be paying for that. Finally, I'll just mention that the financial system and capital markets, one of the aspects of competition between the NOCs is that so far much of the competition they've had over supply and going abroad has not been very public, not very transparent, because they can often work together, and in fact they have many joint ventures to do so. But I would argue that as the capital markets develop in China, there's going to be more and more incentive for them to compete with each other, not just in the eyes of foreign investors, institutional individual, but the individual Chinese investor. And we've seen in the last year the growth of tens of millions of Chinese now putting their money on the capital markets in China. And so it's now, I think it's now clear that the Chinese NOCs, since they are receiving some support from the central government, but not an awful lot, and they are receiving some from working with joint ventures, including other NOCs in other countries, they still, however, have immense capital needs. And so they're going to have to try to distinguish themselves in the eyes of the Chinese individual investor in capital markets. And there they have a lot of different issues. CNPC and Sinopec largely have to deal with unemployment issues too, potential environmental issues. CNOOC doesn't have those issues, being largely an offshore company. It doesn't have the problems that CNPC and Sinopec have. On the other hand, it also doesn't have the visibility and the history. When CNPC can always rely upon the name that Daqing is something that every Chinese person knows, but CNOC is largely offshore. And that perhaps is one of the reasons why CNOC was motivated to try to form a joint venture with, to take over Unocal, because it would give it a reputation amongst individual Chinese as well. So let me just conclude by pointing out that, by reiterating that one of the conclusions of the case study of the Chinese NOCs is that competition can definitely give you some of the efficiencies and some of the motivations that you're looking for to modernize an NOC, but that it also creates some unique obstacles if you're also coming from a system where you haven't also reformed some of the other governmental systems that have been part of your history. So I think I'll stop there. Should I take any questions? Okay.
Presenter is Zhou Zhizhu, who is the director of the Institute for Overseas Investment at CNPC Research Academy of Economics and Technology.
Hello, everyone. I only have 5 slides. Add some my observation thoughts to the presentation by Stevens here. My focus basically focused on Chinese MOC international investment. In this regard, Chinese MOC actually act as IOC, not MOC, because MOC it is the case in China within the country, but CNPC is now doing a lot outside of the country, so he acts as international company cooperate and compete with the other international companies. And in the past almost 10 years, CNPC, Sinopec, Snook achieved very successfully around the world. The picture showing here is just indicating CNPC business around the world. For example, direct investment in upstream, mainly we have many projects in 25 countries. We also offer technology service to 48 countries, and we have also have export equipment to almost 60 countries. So we have achieved a lot and successfully. And this is just a picture show what we're doing now. And all of us, you can read this very clear list of CNPC projects around the world. Because some project in some country, like Sudan and Kazakhstan, the project there is very big, relatively big, and some project in some countries is quite small. So you can, if you will evaluate overseas investment or project over there, you can read the list of the project as attachment on my paper. If we compare, I would like to add something, is that if compare with Japan, CNPC actually achieved great success in outside the country. For example, we CNPC have now produced almost 50 million tons per year in the last year, and we have equity oil almost have reached 38 million tons per year. If we compare with Japan, Japan now, so far, I think only have 20 to 25 million tons per year. But Japan have achieved this level of cost almost 40 years. But for CNPC, almost we have took 12 years from now. And now I would like to focus on the relations between Chinese MOC and the Chinese government. And Amy asked me how to talk about more about the relations between the two sides. And in this regard, I just simply ask myself the three questions. Number one is Chinese MOC are government tools. And the second question is Chinese MOC is acting on behalf of the government. And the third question is Chinese behavior is contained the political will. My answer to the three questions is simply not or no, or partly no. Firstly, we have to answer the first question is that Chinese MOC is or are not government at all. It was in the past, but it's not now. As an oil company, they do its own business. It's no longer government tools. And the second question is that, we, in the past, it is true, CNPC in the early stages, he's acting on behalf of, in some part of the government policy, but it is totally not now. Funny thing is that some overseas project in some project we invested before the 1996 is totally not approved by the government. That means the government not allowed the CNPC to go in abroad because we, at that time, we need more money invested in west part of the country, not allowed the CNPC going abroad. But for CNPC, I think we have to forward-looking, we have to save ourselves. We should have strengthen our reserve base. So we have to go to abroad. So these things we nothing act as on behalf of the government. The last question is, we sometimes it seems our behavior is not contained the political wills, but if specifically speaking, it is true within the country, as a national oil company, we have taken our social and economic responsibility and also political responsibility for the nations as national oil companies. But again, I just mentioned earlier, CNPC doing business in outside act as IOC. So our behavior is not contained any political behavior. China also take its independent diplomatic and international relations with others. So CNPC now in going broad is pursue its own benefits, corporate interests. But the relations between MOC, Chinese MOC and the government is really very close, because now government have to work out very sound national energy strategies for oil industry, and mainly for the 3 national oil companies. And also because of we have a lot of investment around the world, so for the government had to take care of the international relations with the many host countries. We have to strengthen our economic relation with the countries where CNPC has investment. And also, government had to take care of bilateral, multilateral cooperation mechanisms for Chinese national companies. Under the mechanism cooperation or mechanism, the CNPC has a better investment climate to pursue its interests. And also, it's very important for CNPC that we have to carefully deal with MOC to MOC cooperation or partnerships. Because we have many projects in 25 countries, we are now closely working with another national company in host countries. So we have closely working relation with them. And in some countries, for example, in Russia, CNPC has signed strategic alliances with Gazprom in 2004, and we also have signed strategic alliances with Rosneft in 2005. So this is some way we have to go forward in the future. And the CNPC, even we now cooperate with Indian ONGC as well in Sudan, for example. The cooperation seems very successfully, and also we compete somewhere. And now we just thinking we want to further this kind of cooperation with the other MOCs. Of course, we also have challenges ahead. And now we also have to thinking how to cooperate with IOCs. This is a very serious question for us now. For example, in some countries, for example, in Iraq, we now seriously thinking how to cooperate with international oil companies. Okay. And now we just start to close relation with Statoil, and now thinking how to cooperate with a Western-based international company in the near future. So the last slide is my very brief remarks in Chinese MOC in the global context. The number one is Chinese overseas expansion is growing, is a great contribution to enhance the world production and investment. It's not no longer left to the others. The second is further internationalization is pretty much needed, badly needed for Chinese MOC, especially for CNPC as well. So in this regard, we need a more transparent and open to the outside for the cooperation with the other national oil companies and international oil companies. And the corporate partnership I just mentioned will be seriously explored in the future. Thank you.
About the famous Stern report and its dire predictions about Iran's capacity to export oil. Those predictions may be exaggerated, the assumptions may be somewhat unreliable, but that report itself, as a colleague of mine reminded me a few days ago, has certainly got the attention of Iran's leaders, and particularly the leaders within the NIOC. Now, how did we get to this point, and what are the prospects for reform? I'm going to talk a little bit about the historical roots of the situation and then talk about the nature of reform. I want to make it perfectly clear here that I don't subscribe to the thesis, which you've heard a lot these days, that the election of Ahmadinejad as president raises the prospect of a fundamental transformation of Iran's system by which the Pasdaran and his allies in the security establishment take power, in effect exclude other players, and that this sort of populist authoritarian strategy will be reflected in the way in which the NIOC is treated and its role in the economy. I don't see that at all. In fact, what we see is, and this is the basic thesis of our paper, that is, despite the efforts of Ahmadinejad to engage in a kind of limited purge of NIOC, he and many of his allies, rather than really take the NIOC and serve it for their interest, they've bought into the NIOC's whole approach of including more and more subsidiaries and local players in the whole package, and therefore, rather, what we have is a process of co-optation of the Bunyads, the Pasdaran, the revolutionary organizations, into a kind of domestic pie that has, in some sense, in terms of the affiliates of this growing octopus, the NIOC, have grown rather than shrunk. And so I don't subscribe to this notion that we're going back to the populist monopoly situation that existed in the NIOC in the 80s. What we have seen in Iran, and what we try to demonstrate in some detail, and I encourage you to look at the paper to get a sense of that detail, is we have seen a process of moving from state monopoly to state oligopoly, sanctioned by the state, but in which the state is increasingly captured by interests in society in a very inefficient way. And accompanying that has been a process, I'll put on my glasses so I can see what you have there, great, a process of what we call stunted economic reform, a process by which there has been very minor reforms that have loosened up the structure of opportunities for economic investment, but not dramatically changed the basic name of the game. As a consequence, you see this in the reform of the buyback agreements, which are now 14 years instead of 4 years. You have seen it in a proposal to reform Article 44 of the Constitution of Iran, a fairly minor reform that, despite all the talk of privatization, reserves 50% of the privatized assets for provincial parastatals, a classic sort of example of stunted reform. And it, as a consequence, really doesn't create major incentives for foreign investment. In fact, what we've seen the last year or two is a number of companies striking agreements only to back away. And there's a big difference, of course, between coming up with an agreement and executing an agreement. And that has been sort of the unfortunate story thus far of foreign investment. Why is this the case? Iran is a complex system of many players. It is not in any sense a traditional authoritarian system. It is a system of managed, chaotic pluralism, managed by the supreme leader and a host of clerical institutions, the Expediency Council, the Assembly of Experts, the Guardian Council. And all these institutions play a role in negotiating any change that has to do with economic reform, in part because these institutions do or do not have an interest in economic reform, in reforming NIOC, and in part because for some of these institutions, economic reform involves opening up culturally to the West, and they reject that. As a consequence, it has been very difficult in Iran, and we saw this under Khatami, to create a coalition of forces that see it in Iran's interest to have substantial opening of the economy, both on the economic and the cultural level. Khatami had a lot of people in his own cabinet that rejected economic reform. They were the old leftists from the old days. And among the merchants, allied with Rafsanjani, there were a lot of merchants tied to the clerical establishment who saw economic reform as culturally dangerous. So you couldn't put together, we actually had one really nice slide which shows this quite well, which you have to imagine it, that you have these kind of cross-cutting contradictions which have really inhibited the kind of reform making required for effective change in a country like Iran. As a consequence of that, what you have now is a form of parastatal expansion of NIOC's activities, in which particularly, but not exclusively, you see new players such as the Bunyads, the Islamic charitable organizations, and the Pastoran. But I assure you that foreign investors are not keen to be seen as investing as partners either with the Islamic revolutionary troops of the regime, the special guard of the regime, or Islamic charitable foundations, some of which have been responsible for putting bounties on the heads of the likes of Rushdie. As a consequence, the domestic environment has been very antithetical, and as long as the price of oil remains high, the system can go on and on and on. It's a very well institutionalized system. If, however, there was a significant drop in oil production over time, oil prices over time, we might begin to see a realignment of domestic forces that would change perhaps some of the parameters for foreign investment. But my belief is that for real foreign investment opportunities to take place in the NIOC sector and others, you have to have a dramatic change of the nature of the very political system you have in Iran, and I don't foresee that anytime in the future. Thank you.